So now we're going to talk about contraception, and to understand contraception and sterilization, which we'll talk about in a separate session, first we're going to review reproductive physiology, and that's just to make sure we're all using the same language and we have the same understanding. So remember that in the female, all females are born with thousands of follicles on their ovary, and those follicles each contain one, or in dogs, sometimes two eggs. That egg is surrounded by a specialized form of tissue called the zona pellucida. And every time the dog goes through heat, a certain number of those are going to be stimulated to start to develop. That will eventually lead to ovulation or release of those eggs so they can be fertilized. The hormones that cause that to happen are GnRH, or gonadotropin releasing hormone, that's released from the hypothalamus. That stimulates the release of FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, or luteinizing hormone, from the pituitary. And remember that it's follicle stimulating hormone that causes that increase in size, that development of the follicles, and then eventually it's luteinizing hormone that causes ovulation or release of those eggs into the uterus. And so as you can imagine, if we're going to be thinking about how we can control reproduction, these are all places where we could potentially stop the process from happening. This is a picture showing you the ovaries of a dog, and the black arrow is pointing to a follicle, and you can see that when those follicles are very big, these are pre-ovulatory follicles, so these are just about to ovulate. As a veterinarian, when I go in, instead of that ovary being a tiny little slice of tissue about the size of the end of my pinky, it'll be a much larger tissue. It looks almost like a little bunch of grapes, and that's all those follicles that are ready to physically rupture open and release those eggs. In the male, each testis is filled with thousands of these little tubules called the seminiferous tubules, and each one of those tubules is lined by cells called spermatogonia, and those are the cells that divide to become sperm. There are cells that lay around it that those sperm can then develop within, and all of that is contained within all of these separate tubules. Unlike in the female, where it is only periodically that some of those cells are stimulated to divide, males will have stimulation of those cells and division of those cells, whether they're being used for breeding or not. So once a male animal reaches puberty, he will continue to produce sperm continuously throughout his life. The hormonal stimulus for sperm production is testosterone. And testosterone comes from the testicle, and its secretion is stimulated, again, by those same hormones, GnRH, LH, and FSH, named for what they do in the female, but they also have functions in the male, and they are also important for reproduction. Those eggs are released into the uterine tube. The sperm are introduced by insemination or natural breeding. The sperm will swim up to that uterine tube, and that's where fertilization will take place. And once that first sperm reaches that inner lining of the egg, reaches that zona pellucida of the egg, there's an electrochemical reaction that keeps any other sperm from binding there, and then that fertilized egg will move down further into the system. The DNA from the male and the DNA from the female come together, and that fertilized egg then becomes what's called a zygote, and then it starts to undergo embryologic development. And it will float in the dog fairly freely in the uterus for about 17 days before it starts to form a placenta. So again, if we're thinking about contraception, if we're thinking about ways to interrupt that cycle, you can see a lot of places that we could do it. We could affect those hormones, we could affect whether or not that sperm can reach that egg or cause that reaction to occur, we could affect how that egg moves down into the uterus, and those are all potential targets for ways that we could control reproduction in the dog. In this particular session, we're going to be talking about contraception, which is prevention of conception and is generally considered to be reversible, as opposed to sterilization, which is generally considered to be irreversible. So for both the female and the male, I'm going to talk about a couple of different ways that we can do it, drug therapies and what's called immunocontraception, and I'll talk about the drug therapies first. And this is probably what most humans are familiar with, because this, of course, is how it's most commonly done in people, that a woman is given some sort of pill or some sort of patch that has various hormones on it that interrupt her normal menstrual cycle, and we can sort of mimic that in the dog. There are two different drug therapies that have been described for the female dog. One is a form of progesterone, and the other one is a form of androgen. And I'll talk first about the progesterone drug, because that's the one you're more likely to be familiar with. For many years, we had a drug available to us called Ovaban, which was actually a synthetic form of progesterone called magestrol acetate. You could give that drug either well before a dog was in heat, or you gave it at a low dose for about a month. or you could give it within the first couple of days of her starting proestrus, in which case she would come out of heat within about 5 days and wouldn't be fertile in that period. After you take her off of the drug, she's going to come back into heat about 3 months later. And the manufacturer recommends that you not use it the very first heat cycle a dog is going through, and that you not use it for more than 2 heat cycles in a row. The androgen type drug that was approved was called check drops. That is a mild form of androgen called mebolorone, so like a mild form of testosterone. And that particular drug you treated with very differently. You gave it every day as long as you wanted to keep the dog out of heat. The manufacturer never pursued approval through the FDA for that drug to be used in breeding bitches. And so while there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that shows that it's very safe to use in breeding dogs, I just want you to be aware it never went through the official approval process for that. Neither Ovaban nor check drops is available anymore commercially. The manufacturers are not making them. Your veterinarian can get you Majestrol acetate through a human pharmacy, and they can get you mebolorone through a compounding pharmacy. But you need to be aware that they are not available as those brand name drugs anymore. You should also be aware that these drugs, while they will suppress heat for a time, do not allow us to pinpoint when she's going to come back into heat. So sometimes I'll get asked for someone who'll say, well, I've got this hunting dog, I want to use her through the hunting season, then I want her to come into heat right after hunting season so she can have her puppies and be back in shape by the next hunting season. And these drugs do not allow us to pinpoint when she's going to come back into heat. There's variability as to how long it'll be after you withdraw the drugs before the dog will start to cycle again. The other form of contraceptive that's being researched pretty vigorously right now is immunocontraception. And immunocontraception is sort of like vaccinating a dog against their own reproductive tract. So what you're doing is injecting them with some protein that's part of their normal reproduction, so they will produce antibodies against that protein that will either block the effect of that protein or physically block it so that the normal sequence of events that we talked about before can't occur. So it's sort of using their own immune system to trick them into making themselves infertile. In bitches, the 2 proteins that have been used the most are the zona pellucida protein, which is that special lining around the egg, and GnRH, the hormone released from the hypothalamus. The zona pellucida protein is pretty much the same in every species, and so that's valuable because here in the United States we have a lot of pork plants, and all those ovaries from all those pigs, that's not something that we eat. And so you could actually harvest all of those ovaries and use that zona pellucida protein to make a product that you could immunize dogs against their own zona pellucida protein. GnRH is a little bit harder to work with because it is a protein, but it's very, very small, and that means the immune system doesn't see it very well. So it has to be somehow linked to a much larger protein before the immune system will respond to it. The literature so far suggests variable efficacy or success with these products in bitches. The original work that was done with zona pellucida would show that the dogs would not become pregnant while they had built up antibodies to zona pellucida, but oftentimes they would have very erratic heat cycles, and that was not what people were looking for. If people are looking for contraception, they want to shut off reproduction, not just make her infertile, but stop estrous cycling entirely. And the products that were used have not always been shown to successfully be able to do that. A little bit more success with the GnRH-based products, and there's a fair amount of research happening with those products right now. Sometimes you'll see news blurbs about it. They'll talk about the SPAY vaccine, and that's usually what they're talking about is some sort of GnRH vaccine. Nothing approved for use in dogs right now, but this is something that we may well see fairly soon in the future as a contraceptive vaccine for bitches. In males, you can also use drug therapy to suppress spermatogenesis, and you can use progesterone or estrogen. And remember that when we talked about prostate disease, we talked about how you could use those drugs for treating prostate disease and what my concerns were there, and they're the same here. Estrogen is going to stop the prostate gland from secreting fluid, but it doesn't do anything else to protect the health of the prostate gland. So if this is a dog that I just want to reversibly control reproduction in, I don't want to risk his continuing health, and so I'm not going to use estrogen. Similarly with progesterone, there are some negative side effects to this drug if you're using it long-term in male dogs, things like mammary neoplasia, diabetes, increased appetite, so sometimes they'll get a fair amount of weight gain from being on progesterone, and so that's not a drug that I like to use either. GnRH is an interesting drug, and what people often will use here is what's called a GnRH agonist, which is a chemical that's similar to GnRH that sort of works like a super GnRH. And what they've shown in some exotic species is that if you give them a lot of GnRH, it will shut down their testosterone secretion for a time, and so that will shut down spermatogenesis. And this was probably best demonstrated for me by a group of dolphins where they wanted to house them as a family, but they didn't want any inbreeding to occur. So they treated the males with a GnRH agonist as an implant, and while that was in, the male was not producing sperm, and so even if he did try to breed any of the females, nobody could get pregnant. But then when they moved him into a different tank with a female that they did want to have him breed, they removed the implant, and he was able to start to produce sperm again and be fertile. So not something that's been shown to work in dogs yet, but there has been work done in other species. And again, this might be something that we'll see in the future as a possible means for contraception in male dogs. Immunocontraception, people have again tried GnRH in the male dog with the same problems as in the female. It's just too small a protein to really effectively induce much of an immune response, but work is ongoing with the GnRH vaccine for male dogs. And the other proteins people have tried are proteins that are very specific to spermatozoa, with the idea that if you block those, then you don't need to worry that you're having any other sort of collateral effects in the body. And there's very little research looking at that right now. So I think the big take-home message about contraception, reversible reproduction control in dogs and cats, is that we do not right now have an approved product that is effective and safe. But there is some research on the horizon, and this is something that I would be watching for, as I think there will be a lot of interesting products coming available within the next decade. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.